Hey everyone, welcome. My name's JP. I've got Tuana with me. Um, we work at Weaviate. We work in the developer education and experience team. And today we're going to show off one of the new exciting Weaviate agents, more specifically the transformation agent. So what are we going to talk about today? I'll just make that slide a little bit larger. We'll talk about what the transformation agent is, some of the things you can do with the transformation agent, some of the tips and tricks, and how to get started in terms of, what you need to do. So hopefully the how to get started bit is kind of baked in because hopefully you'll be following along and so on. I'll just introduce the transformation agent. It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? To get started. What it is a cloud-based service. So it's not necessarily one of those agents that you might build yourself to do your, bidding or so on. But it is a pre-configured cloud-based service. And of course, you have some room to make it or help it do what you need to do as well. What it does is really exciting because it doesn't just read your data that already exists. It can actually, as the name suggests, um, add to or transform your existing data in Weaviate. And as part of that, it needs access to, it's an agentic service that needs access to your data. So it's at the moment only available for Weaviate cloud users. And I should make that quite clear at this point, as this little agent guy tells you that this Weaviate agent is in technical preview. So that means a couple of things. One is that any future releases might include breaking changes to the API or the client library. So your code that you write today might not work exactly syntax-wise tomorrow. And also, this is another important one about the transformation agent is that now this will update your data objects in your database. So especially you should be careful with it at any point. But especially now when it's in technical preview, please do not use it in your production environment because that's going to update your data. And perhaps if it does something that you didn't want it to do, that's going to be sad times for everybody. Very, very briefly, what this transformation agent is, it's quite simple, really, is that you have some number of objects that you have in your database, in your Weaviate instance, and it might have, columns like your titles, abstracts, so on and so forth. But it might not be in the exact format that you need, right? So the idea with the transformation agent is that you can add or you can update the data so that, it used to be also called data augmentation, for example, but you're going to be doing this in an agentic manner to update your objects. So we'll see more of that in action later on. From a user perspective, what you will be doing to use it is to send instructions to the transformation agent in natural language, which is really cool. So you don't have to specifically specify the steps through which you can update your data, but it's more kind of declarative in that sense, right? So you'll tell the Weaviate agent, hey, update my data in this manner, and it will work on your Weaviate database to update those objects in the way according to your instructions, basically. But the cool thing about it, as you'll see later, is that it's done using natural language and some other required parameters. It is not a no-code or low-code solution. It still is done using code, but there's large language models involved in the steps, so you provide these instructions in natural language. In the repository, there are two versions of the notebook. So under the directory finished notebooks, I've got exactly what it sounds like, a finished version of the notebook. But what we'll do is for the workshop, use the unfinished, partially complete version of the notebook. And if you click on, I'm just going to close this existing one, click on this Open in Colab button. What it'll do is it'll open that Jupyter Notebook in Google Colab, so you don't have to worry about, setting up environments and so on. I've got a sandbox set up as well. So what I've done already is to update these secrets. So the Weaviate Cloud URL and the API key here through my secrets. So you can see essentially the equivalent of a environment variable in a local operating system, but this is done in Colab. So I've got that set up to good to go. Cool. So let's run through this and see how we go. I'm going to do the first step of starting the notebook and to get the standard warning. That's fine. So I'll just run that. And this is just boilerplate code that I wrote so that if you're running in Colab, it'll load the secrets. If you're running it locally, it'll load environment variables from a .env file. But since we're running in Colab, it's pretty happy. And just to confirm that it's done the right thing, I've had it print out the Weaviate Cloud URL that I'm using. You should see some, arbitrary string as part of your URL here. I'm not printing out the API key here just for, security reasons, obviously, even though it's a ephemeral sandbox that'll go away in a couple of weeks. Now, I'm running this in Colab, so it's not going to have all the Python packages that I want. So let's install those. I just kind of wanted to keep the notebook clean, so I've added this flag so it doesn't print out all the outputs as it's pip installing the libraries. So hopefully I think that's all worked. It's got a little green tick. And we've gone through these slides. Now, this so what we're going to work with in terms of data is this Weaviate slash archive papers dataset that Tuan has helpfully curated for us. And it's kind of a very minimal dataset and deliberately so. So what it does include is titles and abstracts of some research papers. So to start with, let's load the dataset and add it to Weaviate. So with this, all you have to do is just run the pre-populated cells. We're going to load the dataset. And what I'm doing is just checking the shape of the data set. So there's 2000 rows here, and there's two columns. And what I'm doing is just inspecting the first row and seeing what properties there are. So we mentioned here that we've got 2000 rows of data. And as we'll be working with the data set, there's probably a couple of reasons to not work with the entire data set, at least at this stage. And one is that there is, at this stage, a rate limit of, I believe, 10,000 objects per Weaviate cloud organization I believe, per day. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tuana. So that's one. And the other reason is that, actually, we're going to be performing all these transformations in terms of adding new properties, updating properties, and so on. So I probably don't want to deal with all 2000 objects at once for a couple of reasons. One is, I might be tuning my prompts. I might, make mistakes and change things around. So, as you'll see later, I'm only going to be working with a subset of this data. And just here, I'm going to be manually inspecting one row of this data. So what I'm doing is loading the first row of this data set and just looking at what the columns look like. So this is techniques for massive data machine learning in astronomy, which is pretty cool. So these are, a lot of really interesting, diverse set of topics from archive, as there tend to be. Just to give you a bit of a preview of what we will be doing, the way I'm going to be iterating through the data is just it's a data set's Hugging Face object, so we can just iterate through it like any other iterable. So what I'm doing is just iterating the first couple of rows and building this object or dictionary in Python called properties. So this one's, the same object we saw about astronomy. And, this one's about some probabilistic model of learning algorithms. And this one's actually biology relevant. So let's start to load that into Weaviate. So if you've set up your secrets correctly, hopefully you have a working Weaviate sandbox URL here. And then if you run the next cell, what I'm going to be doing is connecting to using the helper function to connect to Weaviate Cloud, where my cluster URL is this, and my authentication credentials are the API key that's pre-populated for you in Weaviate, or sorry, by Weaviate Cloud and provisioned for you. I'm going to run that. And this function, the isReady function, should return true. So if it doesn't, you'll get an exception here, and then we can figure out what might be happening. We'll go through a couple of steps to populate the data before we actually figure out what we can and can't do with it, and really put the transformation agent into use. So what we're doing here is setting up a collection. Again, this is just pre-populated for you to use. So if it was like a tutorial where we're teaching you or showing you how to use Weaviate, we might be showing exactly what's going on here. But all you need to know is that here what we're doing is creating a collection. Um, we have a couple of data schema properties. So we have a title and the abstract that mirrors the data structure that we have. And I'm creating a vectorizer, or at least a vector index called default, where it gets the text from the title and the abstract and turns that into a vector. Simple enough. And if you're not sure what's going on there, I've tried to add links to our documentation. So, excuse me, you can get a bit of an overview of where I got this bit of code from and other examples that are similar. And what we're going to do is to add objects to that Weaviate collection. So you'll see, hopefully, that this iterative iter, iteration, or the way I'm iterating through the object here is basically the same as what we did before. The only difference is that, hey, I'm using the papers collection, and I'm using batch import to add these objects that we are building. Here I'm just limiting the import to 50 objects, just in the interest of time and iterating quickly through these data sets. So let's do that. And this is something that we don't always have in examples, but we try to. And what this does is that if there are any errors in the batch import, this is basically like error handling, because the actual process or the actual function call might not fail. So if there's any errors in the batch import, you can use this code block to have a look at some examples of the code. Sorry, examples of failed objects, excuse me. And if I have a look at the length of the collection. That's a built-in Python function, but we've got an override, so you can actually see the number of objects that are in your Weaviate collection. The next thing to do is to run a query just to, inspect the object. And hopefully what we put in is basically what we're going to get out if we run a query and fetch some objects, right? So what I'm doing is to run a fetch objects function, and there's no other criteria as to in terms of what objects I'm getting back from Weaviate here. All I'm doing is getting, hey, 3 objects from Weaviate. Oh yeah, I want to see the vectors as well. And let's iterate through the objects that gets returned and see what that looks like. That's pretty good. I've got, as you said before, we have got some abstracts and titles, which is exactly what we expected. We've got some series of numbers as a, boring series of numbers as vectors. And we have this for 3 objects as we expected. If you want to do this graphically, you can as well. So if you probably have the Weaviate Cloud console open, if you're not like me and didn't accidentally close the right tab. So if I log into Weaviate and if I have a look at the Explorer tool, what we'll see is that now you have, so this is the Explorer tool on the left-hand side of Weaviate Cloud. And if you go to click on that and then click on your sandbox, you'll see the list of collections in the middle tab. And when you click through to that, you'll see a series of objects with, the object UUID and title, what have you, like the actual properties. And we can see that it's ingested the data as specified. And so far, it's done the right thing for me. That's kind of all set up, right? So it's like the boring stuff. Let's try and get some more interesting things. So it's all like vanilla Weaviate or vanilla database things, right? And what I'm trying to do there is what we're trying to do there, especially with China's minimal data set, is to, see where you might have shortcomings with certain forms of data. So here's a question for you. With this data that we have, can you find, say, papers about a specific topic, right? And for me, if I want to do something like that, I would go, oh, maybe I would run a semantic search query or something, of that sort. And perhaps, I would run a query about, let's say, classification, and get the top five objects. And I guess I could do that. One problem with this approach might be now, how do I stop? Where do I stop, right? So if I get the top 50 results, it's going to return all 50 results based on my text similarity. And there's going to be no cutoff as to, hey, when did this stop? When did these papers stop being relevant to my question? If I scroll down to the bottom, I'll get questions like papers like this about something that doesn't seem all that relevant to classification, right? So that's a bit of a problem. Um, and even if I type in something fairly generic as machine learning, um, I get the same problem. What I get is an ordered list of papers, but there's no indication as to, hey, this paper is not maybe not as relevant, but still, is in the on the right topic. And just searching for similarity doesn't quite let me do that. And a filter probably isn't going to be working great for me either, because, well, it could be about machine learning, but maybe they didn't use the words machine learning. Or conversely, even if there are words machine learning, but it might not be about that as a primary topic. So that's a hard one. And the current data doesn't really let us do something like that. Here's another one, which is filtering for exactly that, for that, right? So how can I filter for papers with a particular topic or particular type of paper, right? Can I filter for review papers? You can't really do that based on the current solution. That's why I kind of wrote as a student to do, oh, can you think of a filter? But I also just wrote the note here. It might be difficult because you might be racking your brain as to, oh, how might I possibly do this given the current data? Because I honestly couldn't think of a way to do it myself. Because normally what the way you construct a filter in, lexical search might be something like in particular property, find a substring match, right? But in this particular case, there's no easy way to filter this data set. So where I'm going with this is that, hey, your data isn't always in a shape or form that meets your particular needs, right? And going further than that, hey, what happens if your data's in the wrong language, your abstract is too long, or so on? Of course, you could you can use our friend retrieval augmented generation, but then it's not a perfect solution in this particular instance either. And the reason is, well, maybe you don't want to save your the objects don't persist, the results of a RAG query doesn't persist, and it's not exactly what you're looking for. And how do you perform RAG on every single object? And then what do you do with it, right? So there's not been a great solution for this problem of the data just not being correct in the right does not quite meeting your needs, basically. So that's where the transformation agent comes in. So let's try the first exercise here, which is where I'm going to create a new property called topics. I thought we would structure it this way. So the first thing is to write basically a task or a prompt that you might, provide the language model. So here, the main question is, hey, create a list of topic tags based on the abstract. All the topics should be distinct from each other and provide a maximum of five topics. And look, if there's similar topics, hey, just group it as one thing. So this is basically a tagging problem. And again, I've provided like a link to documentation if you want to have a look at it. Um, I'm not going to go too deep into syntax because you can always look that up. But what we're doing is defining a bunch of an operation, and the specific operation is to append a new property. What are we appending? We're appending a property named topics. It is going to have a data type of not just text, but it's going to be an array of text. Remember, we want to create we, each object could have multiple tags, right? So it's going to be an array, and it's going to be based on the abstract. And this is our instruction that we have written above to the language model. So it's strikingly similar to the kind of stuff you might do manually with, RAG or dealing with the language model. But here, there's a lot more smarts going on than this. The next thing to do is now that we've defined the operation, we have to run it. So the way you would run that is a two-step process. You would define the agent. So to do that, you pass the client object to the agent, define the collection name to work on. And at the moment, we've just got the one operation, but pass the operations as a list. And once you do that, you get the returned object, which I've called TA for transformation agent, and run this update all method. So let's do that pretty quick. And if we look at the response, what does that look like? Well, the response here is just an object that contains the workflow ID. This doesn't mean, as I said here, that the operations are finished. What it is showing us is that the agent is asynchronous. So what the workflow ID here, where the workflow ID here comes in, is that you can use the workflow ID to contact the agent server and see where the job is at. There you go. It's running. It tells you when it started. Um, so it's taken some number of seconds. Now I could kind of hit refresh on it, but it's pretty tedious. So I wrote a little helper function. Again, don't worry about the details of this thing at all. But basically, it just like checks the status every 10 seconds here, and then prints it out. So and then returns the result. So um, let's have that running. And while that's going, let's have a look at some a little bit more detail on what's happening with the transformation agent. And what we showed you in the earlier block of diagram was just the top part of this. So we have some sort of a user sending instructions and other parameters like the target collection to this agent. The agent gets the source object to work on, and then somehow magically it returns the kind of enhanced or the operated on output object that it saves back to Weaviate. Under the hood, it's of course, working with AI models. Surprise, surprise. So it's not quite as simple as this diagram makes out to be, but the crux of it is that it gets your instructions and the objects from Weaviate and sends it to a large language model, right? And the language model is configured then or is instructed to give you the new properties that we want to use. And that updates the transformed objects. And if required, Weaviate will generate new embeddings for the new objects as well. So you can imagine this is actually quite a few things happening. So if we look at the response up there, that's finished. So to update our 50 object, it took just over a minute, right? And and it worked on 50 objects. So, it's not a slow process and that, so it's not a instant process. And that's why it's set up as an asynchronous job. Now that that's done, we can actually do more things with it. So we just added this topics tag to our data set. And if we run this aggregation code with Weaviate, you can see how many of each tag was added to our objects. And I guess it's probably not a surprise that a bunch of these objects in from archive are about machine learning. And so there's like a majority of them, like 60% or so, or 65% or so, that are tagged as machine learning, some are algorithms. And because remember, this is tagging, not classification. So an object can have more than one tag. So that's why this adds up to, far more than, what's the number? 50. Cool. Let's do some more stuff. No, so now that we have this new property called topics, now we can filter the topic with it. And so, going back to the problem of, hey, can we identify papers that are about machine learning? I can just run this filter now where if the property has the word machine in it, I'm going to say that's most likely going to be about machine learning. So I'll have that. And then let's have a look. Yep, this is about some sort of a model. This is about Bayesian, some sort of metric learning. Um, and this is based on the abstract. So I think it would have done a pretty decent job of identifying papers that are about machine learning. And if we look at what individual objects look like, here we go. We have this new additional column or property, excuse me. I keep calling these columns, called topics. And sure enough, we get these lists of topics that are lists of strings, lists of texts. So that's pretty cool. And hopefully you've got an idea of how transformation agent works. I'm gonna trip myself up on that a number of times. So let's do some more stuff. We'll add to in the next stage, a couple more properties. So one is to add a paper type property, because if you look at a paper, it could be a survey, model, system, and so on. So we can add that tag. Yeah, Tuana, please go ahead.
Maybe I can ask it
Yeah.
coming on. So actually, I think maybe you've already mentioned this, but when it comes to tagging with topics, for example, is there a way that we could maybe standardize what those tags are in the first place? So an example is above you had tags that were generated that said machine learning with the M and L capital letters, and then another one that said machine learning with M and L not capital letters, which could cause some inconsistencies. But how would we then, yeah, how would we standardize what those tags are in the first place?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I actually wanted to see what happens if I didn't, because that's what I'm trying to do with this classification. But I wanted to, you're right, that I didn't do it on the first one. So that's a really good point. So I get these fairly esoteric like tags, right? Where how often would I really look to filter for optimism in MDPs in a tag? So I think that would make this particular property maybe better suited for like a vector search later on by topic than it would be by like for filtering. So I guess, well, what do you think is best practice for doing that
I think
for,
I probably asked the question a bit too early because I think what you're doing in the next prompt actually starts to solve that problem in the first place.
yeah. I mean, but it's an interesting one, and it kind of goes back to that the fact that there's language models involved in this whole process. So it really comes down to how precise you are in prompting the thing. I tend to be a little bit sloppy when I when I prompt language models. So I guess would you say I can go back to where my prompt was? I could provide a list of topics here, right?
That's what I would have done. Yes, I would have
Yeah.
provided a list of topics there, and then um, the instruction would be to not go outside of
Hmm.
that. Um,
So I could have it something like
yeah,
choose like choose a or the topics from the below, and then it might be, like computer science,
yeah.
blah blah blah, right? Like machine learning and so on and so forth.
And I suppose it depends on, like, depending on the application, how precise you have to be. So if you don't really mind how many tags there are, if there are different tags, but you do mind how they're structured, the instructions could be tags should always be in lowercase letters, etc. And I
Hmm.
think for the most part, LLMs do a good job of working with that kind of requirement.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, that's a really good point. And I think you're that's re thanks for pointing that out because as I look at the example that I use, because I filter by it, I think once we get the result, and because I'm not being so rigorous with these tags, really I probably should be better off doing like vector search or something like that to find stuff by topic. If I want to do filtering, really the next one would be a better example for filtering, wouldn't it? Thanks. Um, yeah, so the next one's a little bit different in that sense. So here I try to say to the model, oh, use one of these specific um, classifications. And this is, unlike the previous one, going to be, a straight classification in that I'm going to only allow it to provide me one classification and not multiple. So I've left this as a work for everyone to fill out. So let's do this together. What property will this be? Well, will this be called? Let's call that property name. The data type here is, you can see I've left the class here, which is that's an enum. So you can select the right um, object, sorry, data type for the Weaviate object. Last time we used a text array because it was a tagging problem. Now it's classification, so we know it's only going to be one of a particular set of classes. So we'll use text, I can't select that. Okay. Oh, that's a text string. Sorry, that's a doc string. Um, and I'm going to use the abstract as the basis for this. And the instruction is going to be based on our prompt paper type. So let's have a look. It's cool. And I've got a couple of other ones. So I wanted to filter for, or if classification, let's say, is very important to me, it's a topic close to my heart, or I don't know. So I might want to then just be able to clarify or classify um, classification-based papers. I just want a straight up Boolean yes or no answer. I can do that in the same way by saying, oops, I think it's about classification. And this time the data type is going to be Boolean. We'll still use the abstract here. And this is going to be my prompt. Cool. And this is kind of a fun one. Well, so far we've been adding properties, but what I'm going to do, what you can also do, is to update existing properties. So let's say that our audience is, say, primarily bilingual, or one of either English or French speaking. You might want to update the property so it has both an English title and a French title. So in that case, I'm going to update the property name so that the title gets updated using title. And the instruction is to update the title to ensure that it contains the French translation of itself in parentheses after the original title. Now, you'll notice that I don't have the data type as one of the parameters. Um, and the reason for that is that this is an existing property that we're updating, right? So we already know what the data type is, so we don't need to do anything else with that. Cool. And just like we did before, we can now instantiate the transformation agent, and our operations will be these three that we defined above. So what are they called? So we'll add the paper type. We'll add the about classification Boolean, and we'll update the title. That's all we have to do. And I run this. And hopefully you remember how to get the workflow ID. I don't, so I'm just going to look at the list of available functions, and that would be get status. What is the parameter called? Workflow ID is TA response. So we'll look at the response object, and there's there should be a workflow ID attribute here. Cool. So again, it's running. Remember, I'm too lazy to hit refresh all the time. So I'm just going to run my update function again. And hopefully the demo gods are kind to me and this res one's within a reasonable amount of time. I think when I was running this um, uh, in preparation, it was taking like less than a minute every time. So it shouldn't be too much longer after this. But keep in mind that this time we are performing three operations. So these three operations per object. And so it's kind of natural that it might take a little bit longer. But it actually certainly wasn't taking super long when I was running it in the comforts of my own home without an audience watching. But I find that the chance of error does increase exponentially with the audience number. Hey, Scott, you've got a question?
JP. Yeah, I thought since we were waiting a minute, it'd be a good
Yeah,
time to ask.
yeah,
So you mentioned that when we make these changes, it might revectorize.
yes.
So the properties would be easy to remove if we decided like, oh, I really didn't want that after all. But I guess if it revectorizes, that is something we can't undo. Yeah.
Um, I think, trying to correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you can't remove properties at the moment from an existing object in Weaviate. You can set it, I
Oh,
think you can update it and set it to like a null value or the equivalent of a null value, like an empty string. But that's a really good question. One thing you could do is when you define your collection, if I go up far enough in the past, um, in these source properties. Oh, actually, this wouldn't revectorize because this is configured to just use the source properties from title and abstract. So uh, adding the new properties in this case wouldn't do it. Um,
nice.
but Tuana, if I had used the other type of vectorizer, it would revectorize, wouldn't it?
So the way it works is if you don't specify any properties that are to be vectorized, it will automatically vectorize any property that is a text property. So practically
Yeah.
anything that you're adding with the transformation agent
So if I
would
had
then get
it,
automatically vectorized.
so if I had it like this, I think what's it called? Vectorizer,
Yeah.
text to vec, Weaviate. So if I had it like that, um, in the example above, I'm using what's called name vectors, which is a way to have multiple vectors per object in Weaviate. There you have to specify where the vectors come from. But in this one, which is like the alternative syntax, um, you don't specify where the vectors come from. So I think, yeah, this would revectorize. Um,
That makes
This
sense.
would revectorize. And yes to your answer on uh, deleting properties that already exist. We don't have that operation available through the transformation agent just yet. And that's mainly a security measure because you are transforming the source collection right now.
yeah. Um, Yeah, I think Weaviate doesn't let you drop existing properties yet, but I have to double check. Not a million percent sure about that. Hope that answers your question, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, GP.
Thank you. And thanks for that too, because now this is done. Saved me a little bit of awkwardly waiting around for the computer to do its thing. So now if we look at the transformed objects, we see that the, oh, let's make that a little bit longer, 250 characters before truncating. Um, we see that the title, there you go, has French versions of it behind it. Cannot speak to how accurate it is, sadly, but it does exist. We've got a paper type, which now is a string, and we've got a Boolean value for whether it is about classification or not. So what that also means is that we can um, run aggregations on paper types. So now we see that, hey, about half of our papers are about models. How many objects are about classifications? We can run this by filter. We can run this fairly precise now, Boolean filter about classification. And we can actually we can actually inspect what those objects look like. So if we look at the objects where the agent has said, oh, this paper is about classification, the results look pretty reasonable to me, or at least they did when I looked at the objects earlier. Just having a look now, that does look still quite reasonable. And having all these additional properties give us options like, oh, I can now combine these multiple filters. So if I want to find papers that are about different, some model related topic, but about classification, I get these papers there's four of them. There you go. I can do that. Um, and now we have these additional properties that another opportunity that gives us is to combine that with the query agent. So if you missed it, Tuana did an amazing workshop on the query agent earlier. And what the query agent is similar to transformation agent. You just give it natural language commands, right? So we set up a query agent here just by passing the collection to look at and the client. And now, instead of having this boring syntax, with the filters and so on, I can just say to query agent, hey, look, find me papers that are about classifications and tell me about some of them. Just by the way, to let you know, this is, a little bit of hint for the language model. There's a property called about classification that you can use. So let's see how well it does. Um, there's a new feature coming in 1.30 where we can update wow, that was fast. Update the property. So that will actually help us out as well. But here we go. So here are several papers about classification. Here's some of them and summaries. And we can have a look at what searches it used. You can see it ran a Boolean filter, amazing, using the new property that we just created called about classification. So really, what I could have done is to use the transformation agent earlier and use this natural language query. Where is it? That's written here. And I don't really have to know a lot of Weaviate syntax to perform this search because it'll just go ahead, look at the data structure and do the thing. And I can do a similar thing where I can say, oh, I don't remember what the aggregation syntax looks like, or I don't even know that aggregation syntax exists. But I can say, so how many papers are primarily about models? Oh, by the way, I know that there's a property called paper type because I've just set that up. And the query agent goes ahead and does it. And how did it go about doing that? Well, it's used the paper type property that we just added, and where the value is equal to model, and then it's performed an aggregation to get a count. And here we go. Where was the number? It was somewhere up here. Oh, yeah, 26 papers that are about models, which, as you might recall, was the actual number that we got when we did the transform and the query. So this is really, really cool. And as Twana showed in that earlier workshop, you can actually have follow-up queries where you can feed context of, we can feed the previous answer as context and ask question, hey, Twana.
I actually realized that there's something that I genuinely don't know. I don't know if it's possible, but when we have operations that create new properties, I just realized that your aggregation result, it was looking at what was it called? Paper type, was it
Hmm.
the?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Um, I had this with the query agent before, in that in some cases it made sense for me to add a description of the property to the collection.
Mm.
I am not sure if our create property operation allows us to have that sort of description. Does it?
Not through the agent just yet,
That
but
could be a
when
cool feature.
yeah, I've mentioned this to Charles actually. This because I was at the exact same thought when I was doing the demos this week. Um, Great minds and all that. Um, so I think that's going to be really cool with 1.29.1, I think, and onwards, and also 1.30 because we can update the description um, in properties because I think at the moment we can't do that. So that way, yeah, me kind of having to feed examples like this or kind of hints like force feed
Yeah, exactly.
examples like this is a little bit heavy-handed. So yeah, and as you might have guessed, I kind of did it because without it was not always doing it. Like it was sometimes doing it, but not always.
Okay. All right. Cool to know.
Thank
We
you.
can request it as a feature.
Yeah, 100%. Um, and Yeah, so here we go. Oh, this is cool. And this answered the question exactly the way I wanted to answer. So in my follow-up query, I just said, hey, can you select one or two of these papers without specifying what kind of papers and explain them in simple terms? And the query agent understood that I was talking about model papers. And how did it know that? Because that was in the context of the previous question, which was really, really cool. Okay, so nearly done. I thought I'd cover a couple of limitations. So one is that there's, as we mentioned before, 10,000 operations per day per Weaviate Cloud organization. Um, Very glad that I haven't run over that today, just running this demo over and over again while building it. The other one is you can run into a situation where if you run multiple agents at the same time, that can cause essentially race condition type thing. So here's a little dumb demo that I built to show you what can happen. Here I'm rebuilding the collections. I'm like deleting the collection and recreating it. And I'm ingesting the data same way as before, but I'm only ingesting 5 objects, right? So it's going to be an extremely small data set. Let's give that a go. Should be quick. There you go. I've got a now collection with 5 objects. And then I'm going to spin up a transformation agent where I say, hey, create a various versions of this abstract in Spanish, German, and Italian. And because I'm being silly, I'm going to spin up 3 different transformation agents that's going to work on this in parallel because it's just, this is in a for loop. So I'm going to get 3 instances of this transformation agent, and it's going to work through that. So let's see what happens. Um, and I kind of in my head visualize it as like same as, if I had told 3 different people to do the same task and didn't get them to coordinate. And what you'll see now is that I've got 3 different workflow IDs that I've just dumped into this array list. Um, and if I loop through those responses and check the status, um, it's it's just kind of blocking on checking the status of the first one. But we'll see what happens. It's kind of curious. I think it's just the way I've set up the demo, but even though it's only 5 objects, it sometimes takes a little bit longer than the other examples that I've set up. So that's interesting. But again, it's a beta at the moment. So the first one's done. That's completed. Let's see how we're doing with the second one. Still going. And yeah, what we'll hopefully see is that because I'm updating the same objects through different processes or different workflows, they'll kind of be potentially grabbing the same object at different times. And when they write back to the database, they'll be writing different objects. So let's see what happens. I'm going to just loop through every object here, and I'm going to see that whether every object has the three new translations. And we see that even though all of the jobs are finished, three objects don't have these German abstracts. So what's most likely happened is that that was written. And then what happened was while one agent was working on it, another agent grabbed the source object. And, when after the first object had finished, the second agent just kind of wrote over their work. So this can happen. The good news is that this is an obviously extremely arbitrary example with five objects and three operations going in parallel, right? So it's probably quite unlikely to happen in real life, but it can happen if you get unlucky or if you run a workflow that is kind of limiting in this way. So something to keep in mind, but it's unlikely. It's something I should point out. Cool. For further resources, I think, Tuan, I think you are one of the main authors, I think, or if not the main author for this blog. I encourage you to check that out. We've got this documentation as well. And I should have mentioned the Weaviate recipe, which is remiss in saying that. So if you go into Weaviate recipes, under Weaviate services, we have agents, and there's a couple of nice transformation agent notebooks to check out as well. Cool. That's all I had prepared. I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments or grievances. But yeah, thanks for your time and thanks for sticking with us. Sad times for everybody.